Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Crossing of Paths. The cold wind blew through the streets of Montreal, carrying with it the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts and coffee. It was late November, and the city was dressed in the soft, anticipatory silence of the first snow. Despite the chill, the streets were alive with motion. Buses hissed to a stop, vendors called out from steaming food carts, and hurried footsteps clicked against icy sidewalks. Amara had always loved the winter, not for its beauty but for its solitude. Wrapped in her oversized burgundy scarf and an old navy blue coat, she moved like a shadow through the busy streets. Her eyes, dark and searching, scanned the world around her, not for people but for spaces to disappear into. That evening she carried a tattered notebook, her latest collection of poetry, and a growing sense of doubt about her craft. In another part of the city, Adrian shoved his paint-stained hands deep into his coat pockets. A painter by passion, but an accountant by necessity, he'd spent the day wrestling with spreadsheets. Now the hum of the city's pulse felt like a small rebellion against his orderly existence. His tall frame made him stand out in most crowds, but Adrian had mastered the art of blending in. Like Amara, he was more at home in the corners of life than at its center. Fate, or something resembling it, was about to weave their lives together. Amara ducked into a small, dimly lit cafe near the Rue St. Paul. It was the kind of place no one noticed, its door hidden under a canopy of ivy, the windows perpetually fogged. Inside, the air smelled of cinnamon and stories. A crooked bookshelf lined one wall, and the tables were mismatched as if each had its own tale to tell. She settled into a corner, her notebook open in front of her, pen poised. But no words came. Across the room, Adrian was trying not to think about the failed canvas waiting in his studio. The paint had dried hours ago, but the disappointment felt fresh. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, his gaze wandering until it landed on her. Amara felt it, a presence, like a warm light brushing against the edges of her consciousness. She looked up, meeting his eyes across the room. For a moment, time seemed to stutter, the world narrowing to that one connection. Then, embarrassed, she glanced down, her fingers curling tightly around her pen. But Adrian wasn't the kind of person to let a moment slip by. On impulse, he stood, coffee in hand, and made his way to her table. Their conversation began hesitantly, as most do between strangers, but soon it unfolded with surprising ease. Adrian spoke of colors, of how each hue carried its own emotion. Amara, in turn, shared her love for words. How a single line of poetry could echo for years in a reader's heart. They were different, yet oddly alike, their lives shaped by a shared yearning for meaning. The cafe's clock ticked away unnoticed as they delved deeper into each other's worlds. Amara felt the heaviness in her chest begin to lift. Adrian, for the first time in months, felt inspired, not by an idea, but by a person. When they finally stepped outside, the snow had started to fall. Flakes caught in Amara's hair, and Adrian, laughing, brushed them away. They walked together down the street, the city's lights casting a golden glow on the freshly dusted sidewalks. By the time they reached the metro station, Amara felt a pang of regret. Parting felt too soon, too abrupt. She turned to Adrian, her voice soft. "Thank you, for tonight. It's been a while since I've felt," she paused, searching for the word. "Alive," Adrian finished for her, his smile bittersweet. He watched as she descended the stairs into the metro, her figure swallowed by the shadows. For a moment, he considered calling after her, asking for her number, her name. But he hesitated, unsure of whether the connection they shared was meant to be chased or cherished as a fleeting gift. The next morning, as Adrian walked into the gallery where his work was displayed, his heart stopped. There on the wall hung a painting he didn't remember finishing. It was a portrait of a woman, her eyes dark and searching, her hair dusted with snow. A small, tattered notebook rested in her hands. The gallery director rushed over, beaming. "Adrian, it's a masterpiece. When did you create this?" He couldn't answer. The face on the canvas was Amara's, and he never saw her again. Chapter 2. Shadows and Echoes. Adrian couldn't escape her. Every stroke of the brush seemed to summon Amara back into his world. Since the portrait's debut at the gallery, it had received praise from critics and visitors alike. They called it hauntingly vivid, a masterwork. Adrian didn't disagree, but he couldn't shake the unsettling truth. He hadn't painted it. Not consciously, at least. The memory of her had guided his hand, the image emerging in a feverish blur one sleepless night. The city didn't feel the same without her. Adrian retraced his steps to the cafe where they had met, hoping she might appear again, but it seemed she had vanished into thin air. The staff remembered her vaguely, describing her as quiet, polite. Nothing more. No one had a name, a number, a clue to offer. Amara, too, found herself haunted. She had intended to slip quietly back into her routines, letting that evening become another poem in her notebook, a memory tucked away. But something was different. The snow no longer felt comforting. The solitude she had once cherished now felt suffocating. Worse still, the words wouldn't come. Her poetry had always been her anchor, her way of making sense of the world, but now every blank page seemed to mock her. She avoided the cafe, convinced that returning would only deepen her restlessness. Instead, she wandered the city aimlessly, following paths she didn't know. Each turn felt like a gamble, as if her feet were trying to lead her somewhere, or to someone. Weeks passed. Adrian poured his energy into his work, creating obsessively, but everything he painted seemed to echo Amara in some way. A woman standing on a snowy bridge, a pair of hands holding a weathered notebook. Even abstract pieces carried her shadow, a fragment of her profile hidden in the lines, her essence in the color palette. The gallery flourished, and so did Adrian's career. Yet the acclaim only deepened his frustration. How could he celebrate success born of an encounter that had left him so incomplete? Amara's breakthrough came on a gray afternoon in the park. She had sat on a bench for hours, watching the frozen pond, when an elderly man stopped to feed the ducks. They waddled awkwardly over the ice, slipping, righting themselves, and quacking indignantly. Something about their absurd determination made her laugh, truly laugh, for the first time in weeks. It was a small crack in the armor she had built around herself, but it was enough. That night, she opened her notebook again. The words flowed out in a torrent, not just poetry, but thoughts, fears, and memories. Among them, she wrote about Adrian. I met someone who painted a piece of my soul back into place. And then he left, or I left, and now I'm only the outline of what I was. She closed the notebook with a sigh, staring at the pages as if they might reveal what to do next. Neither of them could have predicted the next twist. A friend of Amara's, a fellow writer, invited her to a gallery opening downtown. Amara nearly declined, but relented when she learned it featured portraits inspired by the city. She arrived late, slipping through the crowded room with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to invisibility. And then she saw it. Her face. The painting stood alone on a crimson wall, commanding attention. The details were uncanny, the snowflakes in her hair, the quiet intensity in her eyes. She froze, her heart pounding, her mind racing. How? Adrian, standing nearby, had been watching the crowd with half-hearted interest. But when he saw her, it was as if the air had been punched out of his lungs. She was here, real. He crossed the room in a daze, stopping a few feet away. Amara? She turned slowly, her expression a mixture of disbelief and wonder. How do you know my name? Adrian frowned. You told me. No, she said quietly. I didn't. The words hung between them, heavy with questions neither could answer. Amara's gaze flicked to the painting, then back to him. Why did you paint me? I had to, he said simply. I could not paint you. It's like you've been in my mind ever since that night. I couldn't stop thinking about you. Amara hesitated, torn between fear and something deeper, something she couldn't name. I've been thinking about you too, she admitted. The moment should have been one of clarity, but instead it unraveled into something more mysterious. As they stood there, side by side, Adrian felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Amara seemed to feel it too. Her hand brushed against his, and an electric jolt shot through both of them. Have we met before that night? She asked, her voice barely audible. Adrian opened his mouth to deny it, but stopped. The more he thought about it, the more uncertain he became. Memories surfaced, blurry and indistinct, of places they might have been, words they might have shared. Neither of them noticed the gallery lights flickering briefly, nor the way their reflections in the glass seemed to move out of sync. Something was shifting, something neither of them understood. And somewhere far beyond the city, a snowstorm began to rage. Chapter 3. Fractures in Reality. The snowstorm bore down on the city, fierce and unrelenting, as if the world itself were trying to tell Adrian and Amara something. Inside the gallery, the warm hum of conversation faltered. Patrons glanced uneasily toward the windows, where snow whipped in frenzied patterns. A low rumble of thunder, unusual for winter, rolled through the air. Adrian and Amara stood in the eye of the storm, oblivious to the growing unease around them. "Do you believe in destiny?" Adrian asked suddenly, his voice steady but tinged with an edge of desperation. Amara blinked, startled. "I don't know. I've never thought much about it." He gestured toward the painting, his frustration spilling over. "How else do you explain this? I didn't know your name, didn't know anything about you, but I painted you, exactly as you are. It's like..." He faltered, searching for the right words. "It's like you've always been there, waiting in the edges of my mind." Amara shook her head, her breath shallow. "I don't understand any of this. I don't even know why I came here tonight. Something pulled me here." They both fell silent, the weight of their shared confusion settling heavily between them. But then Amara's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "Have you ever dreamed of me?" she asked hesitantly. Adrian froze. The dreams. He hadn't told anyone about them, not even his closest friends. Ever since that night at the cafe, he had been plagued by vivid, surreal dreams of Amara. In them, they were always together, but not in any place he recognized. Instead, they wandered through strange, impossible landscapes. Endless corridors of books, forests where the trees whispered in languages he didn't understand, and cities suspended in the clouds. "Yes," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "Have you?" Amara's lips parted in shock. "I thought I was losing my mind. Every night since I met you. Dreams of places that couldn't exist, but you were always there." Their words hung in the air like a spell, weaving a fragile connection between them. The gallery lights flickered again, more violently this time, drawing murmurs of concern from the other guests. The curator, a portly man in a tailored suit, clapped his hands to regain attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, forcing a smile, "it seems the storm is causing some technical difficulties. Please enjoy the exhibits, and we'll have everything back to normal shortly." But things were far from normal. As Adrian and Amara exchanged wary glances, a faint sound began to hum at the edges of their hearing. It was soft at first, like the distant chime of a bell. Then it grew louder, discordant, until it resembled the deep, mournful toll of a church bell reverberating through the gallery. The patrons began to shift uneasily, their movements jerky, as if something unseen was pressing down on them. Adrian's chest tightened. "Do you hear that?" Amara nodded, her face pale. "It's coming from..." She trailed off, her eyes locking on the painting of her likeness. Adrian followed her gaze. The portrait had changed. The delicate snowflakes in her hair were now falling, drifting out of the frame and dissipating into the air. The edges of the canvas rippled as though caught in an invisible breeze. Then the painted version of Amara moved. Her eyes flicked toward them, wide with fear, and her painted lips formed a single word: "Run." The gallery erupted into chaos. The humming grew into a deafening roar, shaking the walls. Paintings fell from their hooks, glass frames shattering on the floor. The patrons scrambled toward the exits, but the storm outside raged with unnatural ferocity, the wind slamming against the doors and holding them shut. Adrian grabbed Amara's hand. "We need to get out of here!" "But how?" she shouted over the cacophony, her voice tinged with panic. He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that staying wasn't an option. Pulling her behind him, he wove through the panicked crowd, heading toward the back of the gallery where a service door led to the alley. As they ran, the world around them seemed to warp. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, crawling across the walls like living things. The air grew thick, heavy, as if they were moving through water. Amara stumbled, her grip on Adrian's hand tightening. "I can't," she gasped. "Yes, you can," Adrian urged, his voice firm. "Just a little farther." They reached the door, but when Adrian shoved it open, the alley was gone. In its place was one of the dreamscapes from his visions, a corridor lined with bookshelves stretching endlessly in both directions. The air smelled of parchment and rain, and the faint sound of whispered voices filled the space. This isn't real." Amara whispered, her eyes wide. Adrian turned to her, his jaw clenched. None of this makes sense, but we don't have a choice. We go forward. They stepped into the corridor, the door slamming shut behind them with an echoing finality. The whispers grew louder, distinct words emerging in dozens of overlapping languages. The books on the shelves rustled, their pages flipping as if stirred by an unseen wind. Adrian felt a strange pull, an invisible thread drawing him toward a particular book. He reached for it without thinking, his fingers trembling. The cover was plain, unmarked, but when he opened it, he found a single page with a line scrawled in his own handwriting. "You've been here before." Amara leaned over his shoulder, her breath hitching. "What does it mean?" Adrian shook his head. "I don't know, but I think we're about to find out." As he spoke, the corridor shifted, the walls trembling as a doorway formed ahead of them. Beyond it lay a soft, golden light. They exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. Whatever waited on the other side, they would face it together. Taking her hand, Adrian stepped through the doorway, leaving the gallery and reality behind. Chapter 4: The Liminal Threshold. Adrian and Amara emerged into a world bathed in golden light. The air was warm and thick, carrying the scent of wildflowers and something sweetly metallic, like rain just before it falls. Around them stretched a vast plain, dotted with towering crystalline structures that refracted the light into shifting rainbows. The sky was neither day nor night, but a swirling canvas of colors that seemed to breathe. Amara let go of Adrian's hand and stepped forward, her eyes wide. "Where are we?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the ground beneath them, soft, luminous grass that dimmed slightly with each step they took, as if responding to their presence. He finally looked up and scanned the horizon. "I don't know, but it feels familiar, like I've seen it in the dreams." Amara turned to him, her expression a mixture of fear and wonder. "Adrian, this isn't a dream. This is real." He nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. "I think we've crossed into somewhere else, another place." As they moved deeper into the strange landscape, the whispers returned, faint and rhythmic, like a language carried on the wind. Amara paused, her head tilted. "Do you hear that? The voices?" Adrian nodded. "They've been in the dreams too, but I've never understood them." The sound seemed to beckon them forward, guiding their steps toward one of the crystalline towers. Its surface shimmered like water, yet when Adrian reached out to touch it, it was solid, cool, and smooth beneath his fingers. "Look," Amara said, pointing. Inside the crystal, faint images flickered like reflections on glass. Adrian leaned closer and froze. The images weren't random, they were scenes from their lives. He saw himself painting in his studio, Amara scribbling in her notebook at the cafe, and the moment they had first met. But there were other scenes too, ones that hadn't happened. One showed them standing together on the rooftop of a high tower, the city below them ablaze with light. Another showed them running through a forest, pursued by shadowy figures. And then there was one that made his breath catch. The two of them standing in this golden field, holding hands, their faces calm but resolute. "What does this mean?" Amara whispered, her voice trembling. Adrian shook his head, his eyes fixed on the final image. "I think it's showing us what could be, or what's supposed to be." The whispers grew louder, and the air around them seemed to hum with energy. Without warning, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The crystal tower pulsed with light, and a low, resonant voice emerged from the air around them. "You are not here by chance." Amara gasped, stepping closer to Adrian. "Who's there?" The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it continued, deep and measured. "You have crossed the threshold, as you were always meant to. The bond you share has brought you here, to the heart of the in-between." "The in-between?" Adrian echoed, his voice steady despite the fear prickling at his skin. "A place where possibilities converge, where paths intersect. You have seen it in dreams, but this is no dream. This is where what was and what could be are decided." Amara's fingers dug into Adrian's arm. "What do you want from us?" "Not what I want, what you must decide. The bond between you is ancient, older than this place, older than memory, but it is fragile. The choices you make here will shape not just your lives, but the world beyond." Adrian swallowed hard, his mind racing. "What choices? What are we supposed to do?" The voice grew softer, almost mournful. "Choose to stay, choose to go, choose each other, or choose the void. But know this, Not all bonds survive the crossing. The ground steadied, and the light around them dimmed slightly. Adrian and Amara stood in silence, the weight of the voice's words pressing down on them. Amara turned to him, her face pale but determined. "What do you think it means? About the bond?" Adrian hesitated. "I think it's saying we're connected somehow. Not just now, but across time, across everything. But if we don't make the right choice here, we'll lose it. Maybe forever." Amara stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Do you believe in us? In this bond?" Her question struck him like a physical blow. He thought about everything that had happened, the strange familiarity, the dreams, the way she had lingered in his mind like a half-remembered melody. "Yes," he said finally, "I do." She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Then let's figure this out together." The crystal tower pulsed again, and a doorway appeared in its surface, framed by light. Without hesitation, they stepped through. The landscape on the other side was different, a dark, endless expanse under a sky full of stars. In the distance, a bridge stretched across a chasm, its edges shrouded in mist. The voice returned, quieter now. "The bridge is your trial. Only one may cross at a time. But beware, the bridge will test your bond. It will show you what you fear most, what you desire most. Trust, and you will prevail. Falter, and the bond will break." Adrian and Amara exchanged a glance, their hands tightening around each other. "I'll go first," Adrian said. "No," Amara countered, her voice firm. "We go together." The voice didn't protest, but as they stepped onto the bridge, the ground beneath them shimmered and shifted. The stars above blurred, and the mist thickened. Suddenly, Adrian was alone. "Amara?" he called, his voice echoing in the emptiness. No answer. In front of him, the bridge twisted into a staircase spiraling upward into darkness. And from that darkness came a voice. Amara's voice. But it wasn't calling to him. It was laughing, cold and cruel. "Adrian," it said, mocking, "did you really think you were worthy of me?" He froze, his heart pounding. "This isn't real," he whispered, clenching his fists. "It's not her." But the laughter continued, the staircase stretching endlessly before him. Elsewhere, Amara faced her own trial. The bridge beneath her splintered into fragments, each one reflecting a different memory of Adrian. In some, he smiled at her with warmth and love. In others, he walked away, his face cold and indifferent. "Which is the truth?" a voice asked, a voice that sounded like her own. She clenched her jaw, her fists trembling. "Both are, but I choose the one where he stays." The bridge began to reassemble itself, the pieces shifting and clicking into place. Adrian reached the top of the staircase, and the laughter ceased. He found himself standing on a platform where Amara waited, her expression full of relief and exhaustion. They reached for each other, their hands meeting, and the bridge solidified beneath their feet. The stars above brightened, and the mist dissolved, revealing a path forward. The voice spoke one final time. "You have chosen. The bond holds. For now." Adrian and Amara exchanged a look, their eyes filled with questions they couldn't yet answer. But for the first time, they felt certain of one thing. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And somewhere, deep in the golden light, the crystal towers began to hum with the faint echo of something ancient and unbreakable. Chapter 5. Eternity's Thread. The path stretched out before them, luminous and unbroken. The hum of the crystalline towers faded into silence, leaving Adrian and Amara standing in the stillness of the in-between. The air around them shimmered, alive with potential. Amara glanced at Adrian, her hand still clasped tightly in his. "Did we pass the test?" "I think so," Adrian replied, though uncertainty lingered in his voice. "But I don't think this is over." The voice, now gentler, resonated in the space. "It is never truly over. You have chosen to hold the bond, but every choice carries its weight. The threads you weave today ripple through what was, what is, and what may be. Step forward, and the path will reveal itself." Adrian and Amara exchanged a look. Despite their shared fear, there was a spark of trust between them now, a bond forged not just in longing, but in trial. Together they stepped forward. The landscape shifted again, dissolving into a swirl of light and shadow. When it reformed, they stood on the rooftop of a towering structure, the city below them bathed in twilight. It was the image they had seen in the crystal, this exact moment. Amara moved to the edge, her breath catching as she looked out at the sprawling metropolis. "This is my city," she murmured. "But it's different. Adrian joined her, his brow furrowing. The streets were familiar, but there was an otherworldly quality to everything. The lights burned brighter, the colors were sharper, and the air hummed with an energy he couldn't name. "Maybe it's not your city," he said softly. "Maybe it's what your city could be." Amara nodded slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of her notebook, which had somehow returned to her pocket. She flipped it open, finding a single line scrawled across the first page in handwriting that wasn't hers. "This is where it begins." Behind them, a doorway of light appeared, casting long shadows across the rooftop. The voice spoke again, softer now, as if it were fading. "You have reached the threshold of your worlds. Beyond this doorway lies the life you knew. Crossed together and the bond remains, but your paths may never cross again. Stay here and your bond will anchor you, but the life you knew will fade, a distant memory. Choose wisely." Adrian's chest tightened. "We can't go back to the way things were, can we?" Amara shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "If we go back, we lose this place. But if we stay, we lose the people we were." Adrian finished, his voice heavy. The doorway pulsed with light, a silent reminder of the time slipping away. "What do we do?" Amara whispered, her voice breaking. Adrian turned to her, his hand brushing her cheek. "I don't know what's waiting for us, here or there, but I know that wherever we go, I want to go with you." She smiled faintly, her tears falling freely. "I feel the same, but what if it's not enough?" Adrian's grip on her hand tightened. "Then we make it enough." They stepped toward the doorway together, the light swallowing them whole. When the brightness faded, they were back in the gallery. The hum of conversation filled the air, and the paintings hung untouched on the walls. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the storm, the voices, and the bridge had all been a dream. But they knew better. Amara looked at Adrian, searching his face. "Is it real?" she asked, her voice trembling. Adrian glanced down at her hand in his. The faintest shimmer of golden light flickered between their fingers before fading. He smiled. "Yeah, it's real." The weeks that followed were quiet, almost normal. Adrian returned to his studio, painting with a clarity he had never known before. Each brushstroke carried a piece of the bond he and Amara shared, a thread of their journey woven into every canvas. Amara found her words again, her poetry spilling onto the pages of her notebook like a river finally unblocked. Her verses carried echoes of the in-between, of the crystalline towers and the bridge they had crossed. They didn't speak often of what had happened. They didn't need to. The bond between them was unspoken but unbreakable, an invisible thread that tethered them across space and time. And sometimes, late at night, they would dream of golden fields, star-filled skies, and a love that defied the boundaries of worlds. One winter evening, they found themselves back at the cafe where it had all begun. Snow fell softly outside, and the city lights twinkled in the darkness. Amara sipped her coffee, watching Adrian as he sketched absent-mindedly on a napkin. She smiled. "Do you think it's over?" Adrian looked up, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "I think it's just beginning." Outside, the snowstorm paused for the briefest moment, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. And then the snow began to fall again, gentle and infinite, as their story continued to unfold. Chapter 1. The Unlikely Encounter. The morning sun spilled through the narrow streets of Jaipur, igniting the city in hues of gold and pink. It was a day where the air held a hint of adventure, like the prelude to a story waiting to unfold. The bustling bazaar pulsed with life. Vendors called out their prices, children darted between stalls, and the smell of spices and jasmine mingled with the heat. Amira was no stranger to the chaos. A painter by trade and wanderer by choice, she thrived on the rhythm of unpredictability. Her sketchbook, a patchwork of faces, monuments, and moments, was her most prized possession. She sat cross-legged on the rooftop of her uncle's shop, paintbrush in hand, adding finishing touches to the vibrant image of the Hawa Mahal she had started the previous day. Her world, however, tilted when the call of a stranger echoed below. "Excuse me." Amira glanced down, her curiosity piqued. A man, visibly out of place with his tailored suit and leather satchel, stood awkwardly amidst a sea of shoppers. His dark hair gleamed under the sun, and he clutched a map that appeared more of a hindrance than a guide. "Lost tourist," Amira muttered, smirking. But as their eyes met, hers wide with amusement, his narrowed with frustration, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. "You," he called, pointing to her. "Could you help me, please?" Amira sighed, half annoyed yet intrigued. She climbed down the narrow staircase and appeared before him, her tunic smudged with splashes of paint. "You've got a knack for yelling," she quipped. "Where are you trying to go?" "City Palace," he replied, his British accent crisp and refined. "But this map might as well be in Sanskrit." Amira laughed. "It's upside down," she said, flipping it. "And you're close enough to walk." He blinked, embarrassed but grateful. "Thanks, I'm Ray, by the way." "Amira," she replied. Ray extended his hand, but she merely nodded toward the direction he needed to take. "This way," she said, walking ahead without waiting for him. The city palace, with its grandiose courtyards and intricate carvings, never failed to awe visitors. For Amira, it was just another canvas, but she couldn't resist observing Ray's reaction as they entered. His expression was one of pure wonder, and for a moment Amira felt a pang of pride, as if she had created the marvel herself. "So what brings you to Jaipur?" she asked casually. "Research," Ray said, fiddling with the strap of his satchel. "I'm writing a book on the history of Indian architecture." Amira raised an eyebrow. "That's ambitious for someone who can't read a map." Ray chuckled, his initial awkwardness softening. "I'm good with books, not streets." They wandered through the palace, their conversation flowing effortlessly. Amira found herself drawn to Ray's sincerity, while he was captivated by her sharp wit and the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of her art. By the time they reached the exit, an unspoken connection had formed, a thread tying two disparate souls. "I owe you one," Ray said, hesitating. "How about coffee? My treat." Amira considered him, a part of her tempted. But just as she opened her mouth to respond, a sharp voice interrupted them. "Raymond, there you are." A woman emerged from the crowd, elegant and poised, her presence commanding attention. She linked her arm with Ray's, her smile too perfect to be genuine. "I've been looking everywhere for you," she said, her tone laced with irritation, masked as concern. Ray's demeanor shifted, his easygoing charm replaced by a guarded stiffness. "Amira," he said, his voice strained, "this is Sophia, my fiancée." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Amira felt her chest tighten, her pulse quicken. "Nice to meet you," she managed, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sophia glanced at Amira, her gaze cool and dismissive. "Let's go, Ray," she said, tugging him toward the exit. Ray hesitated, his eyes flickering to Amira as if searching for something, an answer, perhaps, or permission. But she stepped back, the weight of reality settling in. "Goodbye, Ray," Amira said softly. And just like that, he was gone, leaving Amira alone amidst the grandeur of the palace. She looked up at the intricate domes and arches, her heart heavy yet oddly exhilarated. This wasn't the end, she told herself. It was merely the beginning. The sketch she drew that evening captured the essence of the moment. A palace cloaked in twilight, its beauty bittersweet, much like the fleeting connection she had just experienced. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The days following Ray's departure were both strange and restless for Amira. She often found herself wandering the streets of Jaipur, with her sketchbook tucked under her arm, trying to chase away the lingering memory of his gaze and the abruptness of their goodbye. The city, vibrant as ever, pulsed with a rhythm Amira knew well. Yet she felt like a guest in her own world, as if Ray had taken some part of her equilibrium with him. She buried herself in her work, painting feverishly on the rooftop of her uncle's shop. Her hands moved instinctively, each stroke a reflection of emotions she couldn't quite articulate. But no matter how many colors she poured into her canvases, the gnawing sense of unfinished business persisted. It wasn't until a week later, during a late afternoon trip to the bazaar, that her carefully rebuilt routine shattered. Amira had just haggled for a roll of crimson silk when a voice stopped her cold. "Amira?" She turned, the silk slipping from her grasp. There he was, Ray, standing amidst the chaos of the market, looking disheveled and oddly vulnerable. Gone was the polished man in the tailored suit. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes shadowed with fatigue, and his presence felt both unwelcome and intoxicating. "What are you doing here?" Amira's tone was sharper than intended, but the sight of him had stirred a whirlwind of emotions. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I needed to see you." Amira crossed her arms, a defensive barrier against the confusion bubbling within. "What about your fiancée? Does she know you're here?" Ray's expression darkened. "Sophia's not my fiancée, not anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Amira's brows furrowed. "You didn't waste time," she said dryly, though her heart thudded in her chest. "It's complicated," Ray said, his voice low. "We were engaged because our families wanted it, not because we loved each other. Sophia saw that long before I did." Amira bit her lip, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to send him away, to guard herself against the storm he had brought into her life. But another part, the one that had felt alive during their brief encounter, urged her to listen. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked. Ray stepped closer, his voice soft but urgent. "Because when I left, I couldn't stop thinking about you. I thought it was just a passing connection, but—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You made me feel something real, Amira, and I couldn't ignore that." Her breath hitched. For a moment, the bazaar faded away, the vendors, the noise, the vibrant chaos, all replaced by the intensity of his confession. "I don't even know you," she said, her voice trembling. "Then let me change that," Ray replied, his eyes locking onto hers. "Please." Against her better judgment, Amira nodded. They spent the evening walking through the quieter parts of Jaipur, the golden hour casting long shadows and bathing the city in warmth. Ray spoke of his upbringing in London, his love for history, and the weight of expectations that had shaped his life. Amira, in turn, shared stories of her nomadic childhood, her parents' unconventional love story, and the solace she found in her art. Their conversation was effortless, each word peeling back layers of who they were. Amira found herself laughing more than she had in months, and Ray's seriousness melted into something softer, more human. By the time they reached the rooftop of her uncle's shop, the sky was a deep indigo, and the stars had begun to emerge. Amira leaned against the railing, her heart full, yet uneasy. "This feels dangerous," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ray stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The best things often are." Amira turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "You don't belong here, Ray, and I don't fit into your world." "Then let's create our own," he said, the sincerity in his voice making her chest ache. She wanted to believe him, but as she looked at the city below, its lights twinkling like tiny beacons, a creeping sense of foreboding took hold. She had always been cautious with her heart, and Ray felt like a gamble she wasn't sure she could afford. "Good night, Ray," she said, stepping away. He nodded, understanding that she needed space, even if it pained him. "Good night, Amira." As he disappeared into the night, Amira stared at the blank canvas on her easel. For the first time in years, she was afraid of what she might paint. Chapter 3. Unraveling Threads. The days that followed was as if the universe itself had woven Amira into a web of uncertainty. Ray's presence lingered in the back of her mind, a whisper at the edge of every moment, every thought. She tried to ignore it, burying herself in her work, but the city, her city, felt different. It no longer held the same sense of freedom she had always cherished. She spent her mornings in the studio, her paintbrush moving almost mechanically across the canvas, but it was as if her hand didn't know what to create anymore. Her art, once an expression of her soul, had become a cage. The colors felt dull, the lines too sharp. Every stroke she made felt like she was running away from something she couldn't escape. Then one evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon and Jaipur was bathed in a soft amber glow, Amira found herself standing at the same rooftop where she had last seen Ray. She had expected to feel peace, a sense of clarity, but instead the weight of the world pressed down on her chest. The wind carried with it the scent of jasmine, mingling with the faint sound of distant laughter. It was the same familiar rhythm of the city, but now it felt distant, unreachable. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Ray. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me again," he said, his voice a mix of uncertainty and hope. He stood at the threshold, looking disheveled in a way that made him seem both vulnerable and determined. Amira didn't answer immediately. She simply stepped aside, allowing him in. He had been persistent, and despite the internal warning bells ringing in her head, she couldn't bring herself to turn him away. They sat together in silence for a while, the only sound the distant hum of the city below. Ray broke it first, his voice gentle. "I've thought about you every day since we met, Amira. It's not something I can ignore." Amira looked at him, her heart racing despite herself. "Ray, you don't understand. I don't know what this is, what we are. I'm not like Sophia. I don't fit into your world, and you don't fit into mine." Ray's expression faltered, but he didn't look away. "Then let's build a new world together," he said. "I can't promise it will be easy, or that it will make sense, but I know what I feel, and I know it's real." A heavy silence settled between them. Amira felt the pull of his words, the intensity in his eyes. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to take the leap, to give herself the chance to feel something more than the hollow ache inside her. But doubts clouded her mind, a nagging voice telling her that she was about to make a choice that would change everything. "I can't," she said finally, her voice shaking. "I don't want to be the other woman, Ray. I don't want to live in the shadow of your past. I'm not strong enough for that." Ray looked away for a moment, as if wrestling with something inside him. When his gaze returned to hers, there was a quiet resolve in his eyes. "I ended my engagement with Sophia, Amira, the day after I saw you. I told her the truth. I couldn't live a lie anymore." The words hit her like a storm, and for a moment, she could hardly breathe. Her mind raced, trying to process the sudden revelation. The truth he had shared, raw, unfiltered, left her dizzy with the possibilities and the weight of the moment. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Ray replied, moving closer. "I just needed you to know that I'm here with you, not because it's convenient, but because I choose this. I choose you." Amira looked down at her hands, torn between the desire to reach out to him and the fear of what it might cost her. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to navigate the world on her own terms. But Ray made her question everything she had built for herself. "I don't know if I can trust this," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Ray didn't answer at first. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "I don't have all the answers, Amira, but I'm willing to find them with you." For the first time since their paths had crossed, Amira felt the walls around her heart crack just a little. She could feel the sincerity in his touch, the weight of his words. The distance that had once seemed insurmountable was beginning to close, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a dangerous one. The quiet between them deepened as the stars appeared overhead, each one a silent witness to their tangled emotions. Amira closed her eyes, her breath catching as she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. "Stay with me," Ray said softly, breaking the silence. Amira opened her eyes and met his gaze, her heart torn. "I don't know what this is, Ray, but I don't think I can let you go." Ray smiled, a quiet understanding in his eyes. "Then don't. Not yet." And with that, the space between them dissolved, the last thread of doubt unraveling. Amira leaned in, her heart racing, her breath shallow. She kissed him softly, as if testing the waters, unsure of where this would lead, but unable to resist the pull any longer. But as their lips met, the world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the promise of a future uncertain and yet undeniably real. The story was far from finished. If anything, it had only just begun. Chapter 4: Fractures Beneath the Surface. Amira woke to the soft light of dawn creeping through the window, casting long shadows across the room. The night had been a whirlwind, an intoxicating blur of emotions that had left her both exhilarated and uncertain. Ray had stayed until the early hours, talking, laughing, and sharing the quiet moments that neither had expected. In those moments, everything had felt perfect. But as the sun rose, the weight of reality pressed back down on her shoulders. She lay still, trying to hold on to the warmth that his presence had left behind. But something gnawed at her, something she couldn't shake off. She had allowed herself to feel, truly feel, again, and now it was as though she had opened a door that she couldn't shut. Was she ready for this? For him? The sharp knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. She sat up, rubbing her temples, then quickly moved to open it. Ray stood in the doorway, his face drawn with an expression she couldn't quite read. He seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps a reaction or an answer. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft but uncertain. Amira nodded, her stomach tightening. Morning. Ray stepped inside, his eyes searching hers as if looking for some sign, some reassurance. I meant what I said last night, Amira. I know it's soon, and I know things are complicated, but I can't walk away. Not now. Her heart skipped, the words she had been afraid of hearing hanging in the air between them. I'm not sure I'm ready for this, she said quietly, taking a step back. I don't want to rush into something, Ray. I don't want to make the same mistakes. He looked at her, disappointment flickering across his face, but he didn't push. I'm not asking for you to rush. I just need to know if you're willing to take a chance with me. No promises, no expectations. Just see where this can go. Amira's throat tightened. The temptation was there, sharp and alluring, but the doubts crept in again, clouding her judgment. She had seen the way things played out for people who didn't think ahead, who let emotions rule their decisions. She couldn't be one of them. But as she looked at Ray, there was a part of her that wanted to believe in what they had. It was real, wasn't it? The connection they shared, those late-night conversations, the way they could talk without words, the way he had looked at her with something deeper than just fleeting attraction. Still, she couldn't ignore the voice that whispered in her ear, "You're not the only one he's left behind." Ray, she began, her voice steady but firm, I think we need space. I need to figure things out. About us. About everything. His eyes darkened, but he nodded, his jaw tightening. I can't promise I'll stay away, Amira. I care about you, and I'll respect your decision, but I won't give up on us. I'm not asking you to, she said, her voice breaking. I just need time. Ray turned, his hand resting briefly on the doorframe. I'll be here when you're ready. And just like that, he was gone, slipping out of her life as quietly as he had entered. Amira stood frozen in the doorway, her mind a blur of confusion and longing. She didn't know what she wanted. All she knew was that something inside her was unraveling, and she couldn't stop it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of half-hearted attempts at normalcy. Amira spent her days in the studio, throwing herself into her art with a fervor that bordered on obsession. She painted, sketching, and erasing her thoughts, each stroke of color a way to escape the relentless pull of Ray's memory. The space he had left behind felt like a vacuum, drawing everything into it, leaving her adrift. But every time she ventured outside, the streets seemed to whisper his name. His face lingered in the corners of her vision, the sound of his voice echoing in her ears. He was everywhere, but still so far away. Her uncle noticed the shift in her, the heaviness that had replaced her usual lightness. One evening, as Amira sat in the dim glow of the studio, trying to force inspiration from her paintbrush, he stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. You've been avoiding me, he said quietly. Amira didn't look up from her canvas. I'm not avoiding anyone. You're avoiding yourself, he replied gently. You're running, Amira. You always do when things get too real, but you can't outrun the things that matter. You've got to face them. She clenched her jaw, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. I don't know what to do, Uncle. Everything's so complicated. Ray, he's everything I didn't expect, and yet he's everything I've been looking for. But I'm scared. Her uncle watched her silently, his gaze steady. Being scared means you're alive. Don't let fear steal your chance at something good. She wiped her face, nodding in frustration. I don't know if I can trust it. Trust him. You won't know unless you let yourself. Life is messy, Amira. Love is messy, but it's worth it. His words echoed in her mind long after he had left the room. She had spent so long protecting herself, building walls to keep the world and people at bay. But now, those walls felt more like a prison. That evening, Amira found herself standing at the door to Ray's apartment. Her heart raced, the familiar fear rising up again, but this time it wasn't enough to stop her. She had made her decision. She knocked softly, her breath catching in her throat. The door opened, and there he was. Ray, standing in front of her, looking as if he had been waiting for her. I'm sorry, she said before he could speak, her voice trembling. I'm scared, Ray. Scared of what I feel. Scared of what this might mean. But I want to try. I want to see where this goes. With you. Ray's face softened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then quietly he stepped aside and held out his hand to her. Then let's find out together, he said. Amira smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of hope and trepidation. She had no idea where this path would lead, but for the first time in weeks, she was ready to walk it, beside him. And just like that, the fracture between them healed, the distance between them erased. Chapter 5. Full Circle. The days that followed Amira's decision were a slow, steady unfolding. Every moment felt like both a beginning and an end. She and Ray navigated the space between them carefully, each step feeling monumental, as if they were both learning to trust again. The fears that had once held her captive began to loosen their grip, though they lingered like shadows at the edges of her thoughts. Amira found herself opening up in ways she hadn't thought possible. She shared her childhood memories, her deepest insecurities, and even her fears about love. The kind of love that might break her, the kind that had already left scars in its wake. Ray listened with patience, his hand always near hers, as though his presence was a steadying force she couldn't quite explain. He never rushed her, never pushed. He simply was, there in ways she had never allowed anyone to be before. They spent their evenings walking through the city, taking in the sights and sounds of Jaipur. Each new corner, each new experience, was shared between them, like a language neither of them had yet mastered, but was eager to learn. Ray would share stories of his family, of his upbringing in London, of the places he had traveled, and Amira would listen, captivated by the way his voice softened when he spoke about the things he cared for. They were building something, together, without realizing the full scope of it. What they had was simple and fragile, yet it felt like everything. It was in the way they laughed over nothing, the way Ray made her feel like the art she created was more than just paint on canvas, the way she let herself be vulnerable in front of him. But life, as it always does, has a way of testing even the most steadfast of relationships. One evening, a phone call shattered the quiet of Amira's studio. She answered it hesitantly, her fingers trembling as she held the phone to her ear. "Amira, it's Sophia." Her heart skipped. She hadn't heard from Sophia since Ray's departure. The silence between them had been loud, deafening even. "Hi," Amira replied cautiously. "Is everything all right?" Sophia's voice came through, low and strained. "No, it's not. I need to talk to you. About Ray. About everything." Amira felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew where this was going. "What about him?" "I don't know what happened, Amira. I was blind to it before, but now I see. The way he looks at you, it's real. I was wrong to think I could just keep him by my side. I thought he was what I wanted, but I was lying to myself and to him." There was a pause, then a quiet, almost broken sigh. "I know I don't have the right to ask, but if you love him, please take care of him. He's not easy, but he's worth it." Amira's throat tightened. She hadn't expected this, and she wasn't sure how to respond. "Sophia, I never meant for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," Sophia said softly. "I think I knew all along that you were the one who understood him in ways I never could. I'm letting go, Amira. I hope you find what you're both looking for." The conversation ended, leaving Amira with a mix of guilt, of confusion, and a deep sense of loss. She sat there for a long time, her hands still clutching the phone, as if it could somehow bring her back to the present. Ray entered the studio not long after, his expression changing immediately when he saw her face. He closed the door behind him, his brow furrowing in concern. "What's wrong?" Amira took a deep breath, her mind still spinning from the phone call. She looked at him, unsure of how to start. "Sophia called," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "She's letting you go, Ray. She knows." Ray's face softened, but there was no surprise in his eyes. "I thought she would," he said quietly, sitting beside her. "I didn't want to hurt her, but I couldn't live a life that wasn't mine. I'm not perfect, Amira, but I've never been more sure of anything than I am about us." Amira looked at him, her heart breaking for the things they had both lost. "I don't know if I can be the one to heal all the wounds, Ray. I can't fix everything." Ray reached out, gently cupping her cheek in his hand. "You don't have to fix anything, Amira. I don't need you to fix me. I just need you to be here with me, to let me love you." Tears welled in Amira's eyes as the weight of his words settled over her. She had spent so much of her life afraid of loving and being loved, terrified that it would all unravel. But sitting here with him, In this quiet, fragile moment, she realized that love didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be real. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm here, Ray, and I'm not going anywhere." The weeks that followed felt like a dream she was finally ready to live. Amira and Ray began to build a new kind of life together, one that was grounded in honesty, in imperfection, and in the acceptance that they were both works in progress. They took trips to the outskirts of the city, where the landscape was wide and open, and Amira painted with the freedom she had always longed for. Ray, always by her side, became her muse in ways she had never expected. He was the steady presence she had needed, the one who made her believe that everything they had was enough. In time, their bond deepened, strengthened by the struggles they had faced and the honesty they had shared. They learned to trust each other not just with their hearts, but with their fears, their dreams, and the pieces of themselves they had never shown anyone else. And so, amidst the crowded streets and the quiet nights under the stars, Amira and Ray found what they had been searching for all along. Not the perfect love, but one that was true and unyielding. And for the first time in her life, Amira felt complete.